the first meeting of the Kubernetes CSI implementation group. Welcome, everyone. Agenda and notes are linked in the calendar invite. So purpose of this meeting is going to be to drive the actual implementation of CSI and Kubernetes. We've got a crack team of 5 of us who are going to be working on this. So for our first meeting, first topic is to figure out the time and frequency of these meetings. Initially, I proposed every day, but I think that might be a little too aggressive. Jan suggested Monday, Wednesday, Friday. For him, he said 10 a.m. to 10:30 works best for him since he's Eastern Europe. That time works for me. He also suggested 9:30 to 10, but unfortunately I have conflicts at that time. Do folks have a preference? Any opinions?
10 o'clock is 1 for me.
Okay.
And that's fine. I think that just my opinion, a suggestion is that I think at the beginning we will start with the 3 or many times during the week, but I think as the team gets more and more used to it, we can go down, because I would like to kill Friday because it's right on my 1 o'clock time. So
Okay.
but I'm okay to start with.
Okay.
Just
Any other?
Works for me.
Works for you, Chakri?
Yep.
Vlad, you're on mute.
Yeah, it works for me.
Okay, cool. So let's say agreed Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10 a.m. And I'll go ahead and make the change.
I'll give up my happy hour time. That's great.
Oh no. We can punt Fridays too if you guys want.
No, I was just kidding, man. Friday.
I feel bad. I'm ruining your Friday evenings, man. All right. So update invite. That's sorted. Next up is review work and assignments. So in the email that I sent out, Brad and Jan were here last week at the end of the week after the face-to-face. So we had a chance to sit down a little bit and talk in more detail about what the work would be. And the breakdown that we came up with was, I'm going to paste it into the doc. That is not very pretty formatting, but it'll get the job done. So there's changes in the Kubernetes core itself, and there are changes that are external to the Kubernetes core. The changes that are core in the core Kubernetes, we have to be basically on top of. If we slip code freeze, we're going to miss the milestone. So it's super critical that we hit those. And the external changes are not as critical to hit the code freeze, but we should try to align it because we're going to have to do end-to-end testing. And if there's any changes that are required in core, that kind of thing, we want to make sure that we get them in time. So realistically, the deadlines that we're looking at are November 22 for code freeze, and then December 13 for shipping 1.9. Let me throw that in there too for posterity. On the so the initial way that I've broken up the work is on the core Kubernetes side. We have the entry volume plugin that's going to be reaching out and talking to the Kubernetes components or creating the new attached volume objects, etc. For that component, I've broken it down into 2 pieces. One is the API changes, the Kubernetes API changes, and the second part of that is the business logic, which will be implementing the attacher or the attacher, mounter, provisioner. Basically, you're just writing a volume plugin. Because Vlad has done this for Scale.io before, I'm suggesting him to do this, and he's done a pretty good job factoring it for Scale.io. For the API, I want to do it because I've written the design doc and I've got in my head what it looks like. I think the API is going to be the biggest blocking piece up front. Once that's there, everybody else can kind of code against that. So I need to front load that. End-to-end tests. Louis, I put you on this. This is completely optional if you agree to this or not. Okay.
I'm good.
Cool.
Actually, just to add one more comment, that one of the things that I would like to do also, which is not really part of the Kubernetes side, but a part of the CNCF CSI side,
Yep.
which is what I've been discussing this a lot already, and it's no surprise, is that I would like to see a CSI community unit tests and libraries in some repo for the community side. So, and that will feed into somehow this stuff too. So,
Okay.
because then the unit tests and the client or fake mock driver, I think that EMC has, can be pulled into the community repo, and then it can be used here.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So what I did is added a third major section, which is CSI community.
Yeah.
And we can jump to that real quick. I have two items there. One is feeding any required changes back into the CSI spec. So I imagine as we go through starting to implement this, we're going to realize that there's problems with the CSI spec, and we're going to need to push those back in. Since I've already been working with the CSI on the CSI spec, I'm happy to help with that. And the second item there would be interfacing with the CSI community, adding unit tests and libraries, which Louis, I'll put you in charge of. So to finish off the Kubernetes core changes, third item is Cubelet device registration API. So today there is a device registration API that the GPU folks put in place in Cubelet that allows an arbitrary device plugin to come in and register a Unix domain socket. We're going to need to modify that for Kubernetes, for CSI, to be able to register an arbitrary CSI plugin with Kubernetes. This shouldn't be a blocker for us because if we are unable to do this, we could just hard code a known Unix domain socket as a known path. And then once this becomes ready, then we can modify the plugins to actually do proper registration through the appropriate registration mechanism. So that's kind of like a P1 or P2.
Looks like we're going to move this into a good old spreadsheet style tracker.
That would be a good idea. We could have our own mini little, actually we could probably feed this back into the SIG storage spreadsheet and then keep track of it that way instead of having one item that it's hard to tell what the visibility of that is. So a large part of the work is actually going to be external to Kubernetes, which is by design. One part of that is writing an external provisioner that can interface with the external provisioners already exist. Brad Child and his team have written them. We're going to need to create a new provisioner that can talk to CSI. Since Brad has already done this a lot and is very familiar with it, I put him in charge of that. External attacher is going to be new code. It's going to be similar to the external provisioner, whereas the external provisioner today monitors PVC objects and then reacts by creating a new volume. Attacher is going to monitor the new attached volume object and react accordingly. Jan has some good experience writing the controller frameworks. He wrote the PVC controller. And he was very interested in working on this. So I've put his name down for the external attacher. Next up is actually having sample plugins that we are going to launch alpha with. So we were brainstorming last week about what volume plugins we could have that we can test against. And Brad's idea was, why not have a CSI Flex adapter? It's going to kill two birds with one stone. One is it'll give us something to test against. And two is it'll give folks a migration path who are already on Flex to CSI if they're interested in that. Chakri, I put your name down for that if that's okay.
Yeah, because, that should be okay.
Okay, you've got a lot of experience with this as is on the Flex side and Alpha Portworx API. Oh, that would be great.
Yeah, we'll have I'll be at the same time I'm working on all of this. I'm also working on our CSI implementation.
Okay.
So together, so that way it will match perfectly. So it will be another example.
Yep.
Nice.
So actually, you want to add some more basic examples like a NFS?
Yes, that would be freaking awesome.
And let me spread it out in the primary tab because it's Csi. I can take that up actually. That's fine.
Awesome.
But we're not targeting that for this first release, right? Like, if you can,
I think there would be, let's mark them as P2. It's not going to be a blocker if we don't get them, but if we get them, that would be a huge win.
Brad, if you have somebody like already doing that, let me know. Then we can
Yeah.
work with
So as far as a CSI plugin implementation, I believe we have an NFS one floating around. So if we run out of time, we could definitely use what we have.
Yeah.
Actually,
The goal with the sample plugins would be we just want to have something where we can demonstrate at the end of 1.9 that this thing actually works, right?
Yeah, that's important.
That sounds good. I'm going to check existing MC code plugins for NFS if they have one.
Yeah, is that document editable? Because I could just paste.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Completely.
Yeah, I'll paste the location, the GitHub locations for those.
Actually, we want to have all of these, right? Some of them might be there, but I will do the research. Actually, let me do one thing.
Okay.
Again, so let me make them secondary tasks because this guys. I'm just putting my name. It doesn't need to be like if you have something like you already have it, check we already got it covered, then let me know.
Yep.
Yeah.
That would be
The cloud vendor ones, those are interesting because as far as I know, the cloud vendors are moving also out of the Kubernetes tree. So those have to be coordinated with those
question
SIGs.
for the last. So I added a where are we going to develop question at the end. I think that's going to be a big topic. Let's save that for after all of this. So let's say we're going to develop these plugins. We're going to put them
I might need some help on the cloud providers because now the cloud provider authentication credentials, everything has to be going out, right? Today there is a basic assumption they're available.
Yeah, I would just punt on those until the 110 probably.
That might be an option too.
Without this, do you want to do that? Because without this, I think that many people will ask like a.
I would just put them as lower priority than iSCSI and NFS. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
So, question: in November, are we shooting to have? This will be an alpha, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So therefore, that means we don't necessarily have to have all the cloud providers and everything else.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we could target them lower priority. I like the priority that Chakri is assigning. P2 for the cloud provider seems reasonable.
Okay.
Absolutely.
No, I'm just like being Kubernetes and not having a GC looks like okay. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree that.
Let me. Okay, let's not. Let's make it hidden. Okay.
So we're going to have volume plugins that we're going to be able to test against. And then finally, we're going to need some mechanism to be able to deploy these volume plugins. And so we're going to offer a sample external provisioner to say, this is, if you want to deploy your volume plugin, here's a proxy. You give us, you take your container, you take our external provisioner, you take our external attacher, and then you deploy it. And how you deploy it, the packaging mechanism, the daemon set, replica set, that kind of thing, we need to give folks a sample. I'm not sure who to assign to this. I preliminarily threw Lewis's name on it.
That's fine.
Okay.
I'll definitely lead it. I'll definitely pull in whoever I need to.
Okay. So you're going to have to work closely with the folks who are actually developing the volume plugins like Chakri, as well as Brad and Jan, who are developing the Kubernetes components, and you're kind of packaging all of these together and giving other volumes. So imagine other volume vendors come in, they're like, how do I write a volume plugin? I have a container that contains a CSI volume plugin. What do I do? So they're going to look at your documentation. They're going to say, okay, I take my CSI container and I couple it with this component and I put it into a daemon set, and then I deploy it like this. And then I also have a replica set that I deploy my attacher and provisioner with. So that's going to be probably a critical component, because that's actually how people are going to discover and use this. So we got to make sure that we get this right. Yep, requires
when we talk about documentation and things, we'll talk about what I think Brad is adding at the end, which is where.
Yep. I think that's going to be a big question we need to sort out. So actually, let's jump into that. So CSI community, we already talked about. So these were the big 3 areas of work. The next big question is, where are we actually going to develop this? In the past, we haven't had to think about this because everything was in the Kubernetes core repo. We just dump everything in there. Recently, we've started to say, oh, there are things that are not going to be in the Kubernetes repo, and Brad has this external Kubernetes/external storage incubator repo where we've been throwing in experimental things. Today, external provisioners actually lives there, even though external provisioners is pretty much ready to be promoted to not incubator. So the external storage repo may be a good spot to start developing all of this stuff because we don't have a good answer for where it should go yet. So at least for external provisioner and external attacher for CSI, I think both of those could start in the external storage repo. And then the end-to-end deployment packaging can live there as well. But we need to come up with a better story of how this gets promoted and moved out. So if you guys remember the face-to-face, Brad had the whole release engineering section. And we were talking about how do we promote these. And so I think there's an action item from Brad to go and help figure some of that out. He's going to talk to Brian Grant, and I'm going to help him with that. The idea would be we start putting things into the external storage repo as incubator stuff. Once it becomes ready to ship, we have to find permanent homes for it. Now, the most challenging part of this is going to be where the volume plugins live. Common library kind of stuff like external provisioner, external attacher, even the CSI Flex adapter, these things, it makes sense to be hosted somewhere within one of the Kubernetes repos, whether it's a new repo or one of the existing ones, because they have some attachment to Kubernetes itself. But the volume plugins themselves, there's going to be a big question about where we should host them. And we kind of have to set a precedence because...
Well, one second, let me mute myself.
Here. So we're going to have to figure out where we're going to host the volume plugins. Part of this whole effort is to remove them from the core Kubernetes repo so that we don't have to be in charge of maintaining them forever. That's one of the overhead that we're trying to get away from. But at the same time, I was talking to Brad, and I think Chakra, you would probably agree, some of the common ones like NFS and iSCSI, it would make sense to be able to have like an official Kubernetes certified version of these. But it also makes sense to have, like the whole point of CSI is that it should be cross-cluster orchestration system. So it would make sense to collaborate on those types of volume plugins across different orchestration systems.
Yeah, so let me just add to that because what I think that, my opinion, okay, CSI plugins are CSI specific.
Yep.
Our work that we're doing here is Kubernetes specific. And then we're also going to create some CSI plugins just because we're going to plug in it.
Yep.
I believe, this is just my suggestion, that the CSI plugins should go into the container storage interface GitHub, okay? Because they're agnostic to the COs, right?
Yeah.
So, and then our work that we do to enable CSI in Kubernetes should go into a Kubernetes GitHub repo / Kubernetes incubator for now. Well, but I don't know if it should go into external storage. There's already some stuff there, but they could go into Kubernetes incubator and then CSI support or something like that while we create that and then graduate into a Kubernetes repo. That would be my suggestion.
I don't think we're going to have, it's not as controversial whether it's Kubernetes external storage or Kubernetes incubator, wherever. It's not too controversial. The controversial stuff is going to be the volume plugins. I agree the natural home appears to be the container storage interface repository. But the problem with that is if we start throwing volume plugins into the container storage interface repo, we end up with the same exact problem that we have in Kubernetes today, which is that we have a single repo which maintains a bunch of volume plugins which are untested.
Not a single repo. That's just the GitHub team, and then multiple repos for each.
So let me ask a question. Where would we put the cloud provider plugin, for instance, GCE or AWS?
So here's my vision.
What I was going to say is that you don't have to put a plugin in the CSI containers storage interface repo at all. You put it wherever you want. That's the whole point of it. But we need some examples to show others how to write, right? So as a driver writer, I go into container storage interface GitHub repo. That's where the spec is. So I would prefer to have an example like NFS, the one Chakri is going to write, to be there so I could see how to write it. And then I could take my driver and put it wherever the heck I want, right? So
I think that makes sense. Anything that has a some sort of like corporate ownership kind of thing should belong in that corporate repo. So like the GCE stuff should belong in the Google repos. The Dell EMC, you guys have your corporate repos you can throw Scale.io plugins into. But there's going to be a handful of volume plugins which don't have an obvious owner. Those are NFS and iSCSI and things like that. And there, I think I agree with Luis, where it might make sense to have them in like an example repo, example plugin repo in the container storage interface repository.
Let me devil's advocate against that for a second. The more work that we put into the CSI official repo, the more responsibility we have for one, and then which includes like building, maintaining, shipping, testing. Like there is some kind of assurance that once the stuff goes in there that it's certified. Right now, if we can move that outside somehow, we could have the same people working on it, but it isn't as official as having it in the, like the CIS official repository. Like we could have some shared source that's not the main thing that we're all responsible for. And we don't have to decide about building, shipping, milestones, any of the rest of that crap that's going to come along with it just by putting it there. And it also eliminates the potential for it to become a dumping ground or a place where code starts becoming obsolete. We just have stuff, laying around, which sort of takes some of the legitimacy away from the organization, right? Like once we have dead stuff laying around, nobody takes us seriously anymore.
So let me actually talk about those two items that you just mentioned. The first was the tracking of the releasing. Well, somebody has to do it somewhere, and again, it's the location is not critical. It's just a location for code to exist. But again, I go back to, as a driver writer, I read the spec, and I see that somewhere I need to see an example. So I don't really care even if it's a pointer to another repo somewhere. But what I'm saying is that there needs to be a centralized location for CSI driver developers to go to, right?
Sure. So if we keep that out of the main repo, like it could be the same people working on it, but if the code ever goes dead, it doesn't show that the whole project has gone dead. You know what I mean? Like it kind of.
Why would the code go dead?
Well, it just falls out of maintenance. So we write the NFS driver, and 6 months from now, 8 months from now, nobody's maintaining it anymore. It's more of a stain on the the CSI organization if the code lives there than if it's someplace else.
So how does that happen today?
Where would we host the NFS plugin is, I guess, my question then.
Yeah.
Actually, it falls into the broader, right? Because it's the same thing with Nginx and all the other guys too. So maybe, Saad, when you get a chance, can you check with Tim or somebody saying that, okay, what will be their preference, and then just follow that for Kubernetes?
Sorry, ask what?
check with Tim, because it's a broader question, right? For Kubernetes, when you have some outside modules, where do you want to maintain it?
Yeah.
This has nothing to do with Kubernetes, though.
And I think that's where it becomes unclear. When there's a corporate affiliation, it's very obvious where it should be hosted. It should be hosted in the corporate repo for that volume plugin. But there's like these weird plugins in the middle where it's not clear who the owner is.
Well, there's another thing we're not even.
So let me give an example, right? If you take an NFS mount call, there is a Red Hat doing it, Ubuntu Debian doing it, and there are a bunch of other guys. They can all use the same code base, but somewhere it's tested and hosted in a repository, right? So, and think of it like along the similar lines, like somebody checks out the source code, builds the drivers and starts using the distribution. So whether we can put it in the container storage interface needs to have the examples, but does that need to be completely identical with the Kubernetes? Because if I go ahead and change some interface implementation in NFS, and for some reason it breaks some of the existing plugins with the Kubernetes, who's going to maintain it?
No, I think that's I don't know. We're talking about two different things here. We're talking about a CSI implementation of a driver, and then you're talking about Kubernetes. There's two different things.
Yeah, the Kubernetes piece is undisputed, I think.
But I think Chakri's point is that if we don't maintain the volume plugin, theoretically, nobody is end-to-end testing it with Kubernetes.
Exactly.
It's possible that someone could introduce a change which is not compatible with Kubernetes and breaks it, and who's responsible for that?
Isn't that the same problem with Docker and Mesos?
You know, that's the same problem OpenShift has with Kubernetes. It breaks all the time, and it breaks OpenShift. So we usually fork the repo and cut it at a certain release level.
But the whole point with a plugin architecture is that hopefully if something is wrong with that plugin, it doesn't break Kubernetes, right?
Yeah.
Oh, the other way. Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to point out is we also have the possibility of multiple implementation of a plugin from different
Absolutely.
places.
Absolutely. You could have your own NFS CSI plugin. Yeah. I just what I would like is, as a driver writer, say, here's an example.
Yeah. So how about that? Maybe that's the answer then, is in order to remain as neutral as possible, in the container storage interface, there is an example plugins repo. And the disclaimer is that these are just examples. And that is where we're going to publish the neutral volume, handful of neutral volume plugins, including NFS and iSCSI. Anything that can be construed as a non-neutral volume plugin doesn't belong there. If it becomes controversial for any reason, we remove it from there and let the different vendors host them wherever they want to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's incubate. Can we call it like something incubator for the first little while?
I wouldn't want to do that. This whole thing is incubation.
I mean, I think if you throw if we call it example, I think that is enough of a disclaimer.
Incubator mean eventually it'll come out of incubation.
Will. Right? I mean, eventually we want this out of incubation.
Well,
I mean, so I mean, the truth is, like, even inside of Red Hat, like, all the CSI stuff is like catching on like wildfire, right? So people are asking questions about it. They're wanting to do integrations with it like right now. There's people working on, CSI Cinder thing like this instant. So the moment we put anything out there, if we're not real careful, they're going to, suck it up. Considering
I completely agree with you, Brad, but that is Red Hat's. You have to work on that with Red Hat. That's not up to us.
Well, I'm saying it's not just our problem. Like, this is going to happen.
What Brad's point is that we need to be very careful about the wording and everything that we choose here, because we don't want to give a false sense of false guarantees, basically, about the.
Well, CSI as a project, as an overall project, is still in spec form, and it's still not even 1.0. I mean, it has to be understood that the whole project is moving forward in parallel tracks, right? And if somebody's following the project and they want to take a risk, they can start implementing on that. But it has to be understood that we are moving forward as a spec and as an interface across many COs, and we're going to have promotions. So if we start saying this is the whole thing's incubator, we may have a hard time people using. We want people to use it.
Talking about the volume plugins.
Volume plugins.
Yeah, so that's what I mean. What is the whole thing? The Kubernetes interface and volume plugins, right? One's alpha and the other one's incubator.
Actually, we spent a good amount of time on this. So let's break the tie, right? Remember, we are talking about certified drivers, right? Certified plugins. When we have that, we'll have a common repo. till the point of time, let's have it in Kubernetes, which Kubernetes certified, and let's have examples directly, which might be a replica, but it has not been tested with Mesos and Docker.
No,
For whatever
I do not
reason.
agree with that at all. I do not agree with that. The plugins have nothing to do with CO.
Okay, come on. I
No.
think you've been with Red Hat for so many days, right? You know what the ideal world never exists.
I'm just saying that a CSI
It
driver
works.
is a CSI driver is supposed to be in
actually,
CSI team.
Luis, I think where exactly am I saying it wrong? Because when we say we are going to put it in examples, it is certified for Kubernetes. It might work for Mesos and Docker, but somebody has to test it.
Yeah.
And
we are not saying that it's not going to work. What we're saying is that well, we want them to let me put it another way. What I'm trying to show here is that we are an extension of the CSI community. Okay, we are not the Kubernetes community, which is coding CSI. We have to view it the other way. We are an extension of CSI community that's actually implementing this in Kubernetes. If you feel in that mode, then you say,
I agree with you. I completely agree with you. Given the timeline, we are going to completely first verify with Kubernetes, and then we will have a certified repository where you can put your drivers, which is going to be verified with Mesos, Docker, and Kubernetes. And right now, there are discussions about the certified repository, right? When we have that, the examples will move in there. Does it sound fair?
So, question.
I don't know.
Should we be providing a location for plugins repository, or is it up to the person who's creating its own plugin? Because again, the plugin is supposed to be independent.
The person who's creating the plugin is the natural correct answer.
Right.
But the problem is some of these plugins don't have a natural owner, right? NFS and iSCSI are a classic example of that.
Because traditionally, they've been maintained by the Kubernetes community, right?
Right.
So then that should be the same thing here.
So, but I think Lewis's point is, I think Chakri agrees with you. Chakri says, yes, we should probably just incubate it somewhere in one of our incubator repos within Kubernetes. But Lewis's point is that this is broader than just Kubernetes. These volume plugins are going to be applicable to other COs who implement CSI as well.
Which is okay, because the point of CSI is the fact that it's a protocol that anybody can implement. So whatever comes out of this effort from Kubernetes is just a set of CSI plugin that came out of Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that, if somebody feels, they want to use somebody else's implementation of GCP, or
they're not prevented from doing that.
Right. Because I think that
I think the counter argument there would be that whatever we do sets a precedence, and we need to make sure that whatever we decide on, we do it very consciously. I think I'm okay either way.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to make sure that we've had the debate and we agree.
Well, that's why I say that putting an incubator on it is a lot more forgiving than saying this is what we're doing.
Actually, Brad, I disagree there. I think examples is a much better word to use than incubator. Incubator has the implication, like Vlad was saying, that eventually it's going to graduate. And I'm not certain.
So I think we got to be clear what we're talking about. If we're talking about those plugins that have been traditionally provided by the community for the cloud providers, such as AWS, such as Azure. Now, some of them, they do have a natural owner.
So let's just talk iSCSI. That we'll get all the rest of it out of there. iSCSI is the weirdest one because it's the most generic, least owned thing there is, right? Because all the other ones, even the cloud providers, we could say have owners,
right? Even
if they're unattentive, right? But iSCSI is the one that nobody's going to own, everybody's going to want to use.
All right, let's just do iSCSI, and I think NFS you mentioned. Saad.
Yep.
But those two would be. We could get controversial there because there's NFS vendors that may want it. I guess you could say the same thing about iSCSI, but iSCSI is like the first out of the box one that they like generic drivers.
But I think it would be okay if there are 2 vendors or 3 vendors that compete and say, hey, I offer iSCSI or I offer NFS. As long as, it can even be documented in the official Kubernetes documentation. Say, hey, here's a list of NFS vendors who have NFS implementations.
So first off, like, we are doing some of this work, like we are representing CSI, which may be fair. We're doing some of this work like we represent Kubernetes, which may be fair. But we're also both, apprehensive to put the code in either one of those repositories as official. So maybe we should just have like some joke name working committee that we put this stuff under for the time being until we figure out where we really want it to live. For real. Like,
so, let me start over.
One more foundation.
What I say. Let me put it this way. The CSI repo, where the spec is, it's not the official repo for actual drivers that go into production. Instead, it's a repo for examples for driver developers to base it and say, this is how you write a driver, okay? The second thing is, just like Vlad said, is that different vendors may have the implementation of their NFS driver, for example, for NetApp, or their iSCSI driver, for example, for an EMC or Dell. And the customer says, which CSI driver should I use? And they say, use the CSI driver for our iSCSI that was tested by us from this location, okay? So that is separate. Production is separate than the example implementation that is done by CSI drivers. What I'm trying to say is that
that makes sense to me. I think that makes sense to me for both NFS and iSCSI. If we put in the top level container storage interface,
and we say not for production. We say it right there. These are not for production. These are examples.
Yeah,
right?
That's okay. So now we have a home for NFS and CSI, which I think is probably not controversial. Sorry, for iSCSI and for NFS. Then you've got the more challenging ones. So I think Flex adapter makes sense within the Kubernetes org, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Then you got GCEPD, which we would have to host in a Google repo. Azure, I think Microsoft folks would probably pick it up. AWS is going to be fun because we don't have AWS representatives.
So hang on real quick, back to the non-controversial stuff. So I do have some controversy. What's our build strategy going to be? I mean, how are we going to ensure that those plugins work, continue to work?
Brad, here's my thoughts on that. I really like the way that Luis proposed this, which is you make it very clear upfront that this is an example. If anybody wants to use this in production, you're going to have a vendor who takes it and then basically forks it and owns the end-to-end production gradeness of this, which includes...
No, I agree with that too, but if they fork the repository and it doesn't build, that's pretty nasty.
I think those are baby steps that we'll get to. As soon as it doesn't build, we will fix it.
Yeah, I think we could have CI/CD. So for example, in the existing container storage repo interface, there's already CI/CD to make sure that the proto itself builds.
Okay.
So that's a simple Travis thing that we can do.
So I have a question. How, for the other protocols such as CS, the network one.
NFS.
No, the
CNI.
CNI. How is that handled? Because we have Calico.
It's a mess right now, honestly. CNI is not an example to look at the moment.
Okay. All right.
To some extent, we're forging we're establishing a pattern here, and we need to make sure that we set good precedents. Okay. So how about this? Let's say that NFS and iSCSI will be hosted in container storage interface organization in an example repo with an explicit disclaimer that says that they are, for example, at the minimum, we'll have some sort of CI to ensure that it continuously builds and it remains in a good state. If anybody wants to use this stuff in production, they're going to have to fork it and maintain their own versioning and deployment story along with it. Then for the Flex adapter, we can host it in one of the Kubernetes repos, perhaps external storage. For GKE, we're going to host it in a Google repo. And then for Azure and for the other cloud providers, the same story. Or basically vendor-specific repos.
We're not distributing binaries for anything hosted out of the CSI, any of the examples? Are we going to package that at all?
Not that I know of, no.
Okay.
As long, I mean, I'll be satisfied as long as everything you just said, Saad, is listed somewhere in the official Kubernetes documentation. Because one of the things we're doing with this is basically taking something that, you know, one place. When I download Kubernetes now, I have everything at my disposal.
Yeah.
But once we break everything apart, potentially, you know, we can have drivers all over the place. As long as
I think that'll be a discussion we need to have on the CSI side of things is discovery of volume plugins. That's probably something we should do before we go to 1.0. I think the ideas tossed around were as crazy as having something similar to the Docker registry to as simple as just a GitHub page with a list of compatible plugins or absolutely nothing at all. And we're going to have that discussion, but I don't think we need to do that before alpha.
Right. Okay. Because we have a lot to do before alpha, so.
Yes. Okay, so it's settled. I'll update the notes with that. And then the final topic I had for discussion was the Csi Spec Status. For those of you who have been sitting in on the Csi Spec meetings, you'll notice that it's still a work in progress.
Just a quick thing. Sorry, Saad, to interrupt you. I really feel really bad, but we're 15 minutes over. I'm 15 minutes late to my next meeting.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, we can continue the last topic at the next meeting.
The Wednesday? Would that be Wednesday?
What's that? Wednesday, correct.
Tomorrow, I guess.
Correct.
I'll see you again. I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, guys.
No problem. Bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye.